And where in my young years I might take advantage of it on occasion where it might benefit me, I never ever took advantage of it where it would destroy their society. But I saw many others who would. We have been so lucky in this nation, and most of us have no conception, no idea, not the remotest inkling of what that means. Because most Americans have never visited foreign countries in their entire life. When they do, they go to places like Paris, Berlin, London, Geneva, Mexico City, Rio de Janeiro. And while they're there, they ignore the poor, the beggars, the little children in the streets competing to try to shine your shoes. They overlook that, thinking that's an aberration, but it's not. It's an indication of the extreme poverty that lies just beyond the surface, where in those great cities it is concealed by the authorities so that you, the tourist, will never see it, never understand it, never know anything about it. You don't see shoeshine boys in the United States of America. If that kind of poverty existed here, you would. You used to in the early days of this country, when there was that kind of poverty in this nation. But unlike this nation, where at one time there was that kind of poverty, in these other nations there's never been the opportunity to rise above it, as there has always been in this country. For all people. I don't care what your race or religion is. And don't give me all this crap about slavery and the black experience and I was a Jew and I was discriminated against and the Irish thing and all that kind of crap. All that was overcome in this country by people who truly understood the way this nation worked and realized the ability to rise above it. And eventually the people of this country, let me tell you this, it wasn't just the blacks who rose up and overturned discrimination. You see, because the blacks were a very small minority, without a tremendous wave of support throughout this nation, amongst all races and religions, it could never have happened. It had to happen. It was going to happen. It did happen. And it could not have happened anywhere else under the same circumstances. We failed to realize the supreme significance of having been born in the greatest nation that's ever existed upon the face of this earth, the only nation that ever granted to the common man freedom. Freedom. The only nation in the history of the world. The nation that sparked revolutionary movements throughout the world. The nation that created the movement to overthrow kings, queens, monarchs, emirs, sultans, emperors from off their thrones, from that historic moment to this. And that's really the whole purpose for the whole thing to begin with. For there's been a grand design to the construction of the United States of America since before the first settlers came to these shores. And if you don't believe that, read Bacon's The New Atlantis. And then go back in history and read Plato's Atlantis. And then go back and read Bacon's The New Atlantis again. And then begin to read the writings of the Founding Fathers. Read their references to the secret destiny of America, to the divine inspiration. of the founding of this nation. Read their plans for the New World. Go back before that to Europe. During the first settlements sent to this country, and read writings which echoed previous to the writings of the Founding Fathers, many of the same sentiments and the same words and same references to the New World and the New Atlantis. And you may begin to get some kind of an inkling as to what I am referring to. If you really want to get into it in depth, go to my series on Mystery Babylon, and it will open your eyes beyond anything that you ever felt they could be opened before. For the first time in the history of the entire world, man sat down and ignored the history of the world and said, we don't give a damn about the divine right of rulership of kings. We don't care about our subservient status to aristocracy and royalty. We recognize something that's never been recognized before in the history of the world. There's a God. God created man in his own image, and God created man with certain unalienable rights, which we recognized, and they enumerated those rights, and they created a government to recognize the supremacy and sovereignty of the individual above kings and queens and governments, under the laws of God, with certain unalienable rights recognized and protected by the state. And they created the United States of America. And never in the history of the world was there so much opportunity, so much promise, so much happiness, so much work, so much risk. And in attempting to achieve that happiness, that equality, that place that every man believes that he has in this world and strives to obtain, there was always a risk of sudden death, a risk of having everything that one had ever obtained by the sweat of his brow stolen in a second. The risk of being crippled or maimed. There was a risk, but without that risk, without the risk, the great achievement that the men and women who lived in this country, who achieved and accomplished way beyond what any other country has ever achieved in the history of the world, would never have come to pass. Never. If they had laid down and said, we're the working class and we're the victims of the bourgeoisie and the rich, and we need to be taken care of, and we need to foment revolution and overthrow this republic so that we can have some kind of a socialist bullshit crap state, so that that state can take care of us and make sure that we don't have any risk and we don't have to work for anything. It never would have happened. None of it would have ever happened. Nothing would have happened. There would never have been the tremendous success in this nation that occurred over all those years. There would never have risen up in this world a middle class, which in the history of the world had never existed. A middle class. People who had achieved wealth beyond their parents' dreams. Even though by modern day standards it could be considered a modest degree of wealth, it was nevertheless something that the common man had never even hoped to dream of in the history of this world. they achieved it. And every generation afterward, the children lived a better life than their parents, unless they were totally incompetent, fell victim to some terrible disease or some accident, or fell into a life of crime. This was the Valhalla, the heaven, the promised land for all of the oppressed, the poor people of the world. And from every single nation upon the face of this earth, every single poor person looked to America for his salvation. And they tried with all their might, many of them dying in the process, to get here in order to found for themselves that promise for their children, that their children would live better off than they did, and their children's children would live even better than their children had lived. And only in this country was that possible out of all of the nations in the entire world. And it began with something that you're going to hear extensively about tomorrow night, called the Unanimous Declaration of the 13 Colonies, now today known as the Declaration of Independence. Now that's when it officially began legally and lawfully on a piece of paper, which to this day is the founding document in law, still valid today as it was then, of the United States of America. There were things that happened before that set the stage. People lost their lives before that document was penned. And we've talked about some of those things before on this broadcast. But tonight I wanted to just give you some insight into my understanding of where I am in relationship to the world as a citizen born in the state of California with my domicile in the state of Arizona, being a citizen of those two states by virtue of those two things, a part of the United States of America, and what it means to me. You see, I've been all around the world, not just as a boy, but in the military. I was in the Air Force for 4 years and in the Navy for over 10. Actually in the Air Force for over 4. For active duty, about 8 months or so as part of the Air Force Reserve. I am not anti-government, to the contrary. No one in this world loves our government more than me, nor could they, in their wildest dreams, ever love it more than me. As much maybe, but never more. But you have to understand exactly what this government is. The government is the Constitution for the United States of America, the Bill of Rights, and the lawful amendments thereto. That sets out the structure of our government. It sets out the limitations to that government and grants it very few, very limited powers. All of the powers fall to the states, and if not exercised by the states, then to us, we the people. Most Americans have no conception of any of this. They don't understand it. They don't know anything about it. They don't know their special place in this universe. They have no conception, no idea that they are sovereign kings and queens in their own right, and that the government was created to serve us